Everyone to Uprising 213. From Marx to Mao and Maoist insurrection. Mao's thoughts, writings, and his reception in the 1960s and 70s in the West and the South offer a very different model of uprising than the modern concept of revolution that we explored in Uprising 113 with Etienne Balibar, Simona Forti, and Gayatri Spivak. The difference is somewhat paradoxical or surprising. After all, Mao was himself a staunch Marxist and placed himself in the direct lineage of Marx, Engels, and Lenin. Mao was also one of the few leaders who would actualize, or could be interpreted as having actualized, a Marxist revolution that placed a People's Party in power in the 20th century. A peasant revolution, to be sure, not the more classically Marxist revolution of industrialized workers, but nevertheless a revolution of the masses. Mao was a brilliant strategist and, in a vanguardist way, inspired an insurgency that became a social revolution, the very cornerstone of the modern conception of revolution as Koselleck imagined it, that is, characterized by the movement from political to social upheaval. And Mao later put into effect a second social revolution, the Cultural Revolution, that also carried the name revolution. Yet despite all that, the modality of uprising that we might identify with Mao, at least today, is different than the prototypical class struggle and modern revolution. There's a distinct shift in the way that uprising is conceptualized from Marx to Mao, a shift that we might call towards a model of insurrection or insurgency. And it's, of course, to this model of Maoist insurrection that we're going to turn to today in 213. Now, I would propose as a preliminary working hypothesis that the shift from Marx to Mao and to Maoist insurrection is related primarily to two important transitions or differences. The first is a certain loosening of the grip of the philosophy of history, a gradual loosening in Mao's thought, but even more so in the later receptions of his thought starting in the 1960s and 70s. Mao himself started with a strong Marxist philosophy of history, no doubt, but I would argue that it slowly leaked out of his writings, and even more so out of his reception, so that today, Maoist-inspired insurrectional writings, such as the Invisible Committee's The Coming Insurrection in 2007, have a far less determinist historical backbone. The second difference is more conjunctural, especially in the reception of Mao in the West and in the South. The rise of Maoist-inspired thought, particularly in France, at least in the late 1960s, was practically determined by the historical conjuncture of a Stalinist-dominated Communist Party, still completely captured by the Soviet Union, and the absence of an attractive socialist alternative. In this respect, I agree entirely with Clare Fulton that the conjunctural reception in the West and South has to be understood through the lens of a certain Orientalism and of the projection of Western leftist desires onto Maoist China. The result of both the loosening of the philosophy of history and the conjunctural nature of the later reception of Maoist thought produces, I would argue, a distinct model of insurrection as a form of uprising. And to summarize that model, I would say that the shift from Marx to Mao and then to Maoist insurrection today can be characterized as a transformation first from a Marxist model of binary class struggle that necessarily leads to revolutionary upheaval as a product of dialectical materialism, to, second, with Mao, a paradigm in Mao's writings of a tripartite warfare in which a small minority of insurgents can win over the peasant masses using insurgency theory and practices, to today, a Maoist-inspired insurrectional notion of an embattled minority in violent struggle against a police state, but with little hope, perhaps, of gaining the allegiance of the neoliberal masses. This ultimately leads to, today, I feel, a more separatist insurrectional modality that seems less sure of its future, a vision that may entail a more permanent state of civil war and insurrectional conflict. But these, of course, are the questions that we want to pose and explore and discuss today. And with us to do just that, we have three outstanding guest speakers and authors who we've flown in from Bologna, and Palermo. Our first intervener tonight is Fulvia Carnevale, an artist and a member, along with James Thornhill, of the artistic cooperative Clare Fulton. The name of Clare Fulton, the ready-made name of Clare Fulton, many of you will realize is taken from a popular brand of French stationery. Of course, I have my Clare Fulton with me right now. And of course, Clare Fulton, the artist, also describes herself as a ready-made artist who finds herself working within the context of a politically impotent contemporary society. As her assistants, Carnevale and Thornhill make her objects, paintings, neons, videos, and in the case of this seminar, also answer questions about her work. As you've seen from our blog, there are written texts as well that are at the core of Clare Fulton's work, and we're fortunate to have two now on our 213 site. Fulvia Carnevale was also one of the editors and members of Tikkun, a French philosophical journal that published 2 issues in 1999 and 2001, with the stated goal of recreating the conditions of another community. And this, of course, will be highly relevant to our discussion tonight. Our second speaker, Claudia Pozzana, is a professor in the Department of History, Cultures, and Civilization at the University of Bologna, and well known to some of us in the audience. Professor Pozzana studied Chinese at the University Ca' Foscari in Venice, and then spent several years in China, including from 1974 to 76, which were, of course, rich years for our topic of Maoist insurrection. And she's been a researcher of Chinese language and literature, as well as modern and contemporary history since 1984. Some of her important recent contributions include an article, Althusser and Mao, a political test for dialectics in the idea of communism at Russo, 2016, and with Alessandro Russo, Continuity, Discontinuity, China's Place in the Contemporary World. Our third speaker, Alessandro Russo, is a sociologist and a specialist in Chinese studies. He is a professor of sociology at the University of Bologna, and has taught as well in other institutions, including as the Wei Lun Chairing Visiting Professorship at Qinghua University and at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Humanities and Social Sciences. Among his many publications, we can mention his recently submitted book at Duke University Press, Cultural Revolution and Revolutionary Culture, as well as his recent articles on the theme of the Cultural Revolution and Mao's idea of probable defeat. For instance, the article, How did the Cultural Revolution End? The Last Dispute Between Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping. And also Trespassing, Alain Badiou, Politics and Philosophy. So after our guests have made short presentations, my comrade in arms, Jesus Velasco, our brilliant medievalist and critical theorist here at Columbia, and my brilliant young colleague, Jeremy Kessler, legal historian, professor of law, and one of the ablest critical theorists, will moderate the discussion. And we're blessed at Columbia this evening to have such extraordinary scholars with such a range of legal history, critical theory, and philosophy. And also to have around the table so many brilliant students of ours from across the disciplines, as well as faculty members from across the disciplines, Adam Tooze, Etienne Balibar, Aurélie Violette, Clara Mattei, Karuna Mantena, Bruno Bostiles, Jack Halberstam, Eleonora Bottini, Thomas Dodman, and many others. So let me turn it over then to Fulvia.
Right. Thank you so much, Bernard, for this beautiful presentation and for inviting me here tonight, and thank you all of you for coming. So just would like to make a precision, which is that I am not an academic, and so the things I am going to say are part of our theoretical and artistic research. We don't have a hierarchy between these two medias. For us, theory is one of the media that we use. And therefore, the character of my contribution is going to be structurally different in the sense that it doesn't have a scientific ambition. It has a different ambition that I don't want to define, and maybe we could discuss at the end of what I'm going to say. So I have decided to tackle this question, to respond to this invitation, by talking about a tendency that existed in the Italian movement of '77, which is Mao Dadaism. And I didn't know that Claudia and Alessandro were also protagonists of the movement of '77 and based in Bologna at the time. So it's going to be very interesting to hear what they think about what I'm going to say, because I was 2 years old and I wasn't present at the moment of the facts. So Mao Dadaism, you will also see some images there which come from an open source, like a copyright-free data bank of images that have been put together by the publishing house Deriva Prodi in the context of their research on the autonomous movement in Italy, which has been published in, I believe, 3 volumes at this stage. And so you see now some images of Attraverso, and then you will see some images of Bologna and other images of the Metropolitan Indians that we're going to say what they are in a minute. So Mao Dadaism curiously resonates with our present. That's why I want to talk about this in particular. The problem, especially of fake news, is explicitly theorized throughout the movement of Italian '77, but it's formulated clearly in the program of Radio Alice, which was a free radio from Bologna that became a sort of symbol of '77. Delivering fake news meant for them going beyond the mirror, beyond the logic of symmetrically opposing the power and opposing truth to his lies. The language from beyond the mirror was dirty, spoken, it entertained a passionate relationship with the body and desire, and it was full of irony and humor. It had learned the lesson of schizoanalysis and tried to free people from their superego. Deleuze and Guattari, in 1975, published their extraordinary book on Kafka and the minor literature, where it's explicitly said that the project of the minor literature is to find our inner third world. I quote them: "How many people live today in a language that is not their own, or else no longer even know their tongue, or do not know it yet, and know a major tongue which they are forced to use poorly? Problem of immigrants, and especially of their children. Problem of minorities. Problem of a minor literature, but also the problem of us all, how to wrest a minor literature from our tongue, a literature that can hollow the language out and spin it along a sober, revolutionary line, how to become the nomad and the immigrant and the gypsy of our own language. Steal the infant from its cradle," Kafka says, "dance on the tight rope." End of the quote. This was 1975. The Metropolitan Indians, that you can see, probably you've already seen in these images, were also part of the same political area of the Mao Dadaists. They were people that occupied the public space wearing tribal makeup, costumes, and feathers. Through their invented mythological foreignness of indigenous colonized by capitalism, they were showing the true marginalization of youth and the proletarians. Their language, often mimicking a broken Italian like the English language spoken in Westerns, was an important part of the revolutionary project and appeared also in text addressed to politicians. There is a beautiful communication to Cossiga that was then the Minister of the Interior, where Cossiga is called pale-faced and is told to be having a forked tongue. Andrea Pazienza also talks about this dirty language that is supposed to be more faithful to the movement. And Andrea Pazienza was a very important figure of this movement. He was a cartoonist and a writer. And he explains that it's a way to maintain the the language in motion. This idea of having a radio is an idea of connecting the language not only to its spoken aspect, but to the body and giving it an immediacy, because the radio was also used in the public space and people would phone up from the public space to the radio, and so they would create through this news that they were giving actions, happenings, and things that were, you know, taking place in the space, in the public space, as they were transmitting. So Maoism was used as a defunctionalized sign. So was Marx, by the way, found in slogans like "I am a Marxist tendency, Groucho," or "After Marx, April; after Mao, June." He was understood. It was understood in a poetic fashion by the so-called creative wing of '77 movement as a form of Dadaism. If we really comprehend what Mao says, then he's the biggest Dadaist in the world, they said. Debauchery, tumult, party were terms used by the movement itself to describe their daily revolution, meant to transform life. And they weren't empty slogans. Radio Alice attraverso in Bologna and masses of people uprising throughout the whole country were, for a few years, a real force that left indelible traces even in the official culture. I have quotes from Umberto Eco, but I don't think I'm going to have time to read them now. Eventually we can come back on this because he wrote a lot about '77 at the time. The most relevant aspect of Mao Dadaism was its relationship with truth, as I was saying in the beginning, as more than just the opposite and the unmasking of lies. In an article published on Attraverso in '77, entitled "Fake News That Produce True Events," we can read that counter-information was insufficient because it corresponded in a specular way to the discourse of power, whether a more interesting strategy was to hijack the truths of power, to speak with its voice. Counter-information, I quote them, I will read you this quote that is already on the blog, but I find it so nice that I want to share it with you again, has denounced the lies of power. It has shown where the mirror of power reflects reality in a deformed way. It has re-established truth, but as a pure mirroring process. Radio Alice, the language beyond the mirror, has built the space in which the subject recognizes himself, not anymore as a mirror, as a re-established reality, as a fixed reproduction, but as a practice of existence in transformation. And the language is one level of the transformation. Now, let's go beyond that. It's not enough to denounce power's lies. We need to denounce and break power's truth. When the power tells the truth and pretends it's natural, we need to denounce how inhuman and absurd the order of reality that is reflected, reproduced, and consolidated by the order of speech, the speech of order, is. Let's uncover the active delirious of power. In Italian, it's deliranza, which is really beautiful. It's this idea that, you know, we have it before our eyes every day in the United States, in this moment, the deliranza, no? This craziness of power that doesn't know its limits and doesn't understand what it's saying itself. But not only, we need to take the self-validating place of power, speak with his voice, emit signs with the voice and the tone of power, but fake signs. Let's produce information that shows what the power hides and that produces a revolt against the strength of the speech of order. Let's reproduce the magic game of the falsifying truth in order to tell with the language of the mass media what they want to conjure. A little shift is enough and the power will show his delirious. Lama, which was the head of the unions at the time, the left-wing unions, the CGL, says every day that the absentees must be shot. But this truth of power hides behind a small linguistic screen. The strength of power resides in speaking with the power of strength. Let's get the prefecture to say that it's right to take meat for free from the butcheries. Reality transforms language. Language can transform reality, building the cells of action, Mao Dada. So these political tendencies were difficult to decipher for the power, but also for the intellectuals of the time. The press spoke of diffuse irrationalism, which is very interesting when we think about what capitalist reason is and to which extent the denial of the evidence, it being racism, ecological catastrophe, the conflict of interest of the people in power themselves, is an integral part of it. By refusing to descend on such a low level of depressing confrontation with power, this movement gave an extraordinary lesson of dangerous creativity, unmasking by using it as at a second degree, in the form of a détournement, the vocabulary of our oppression. I think I have so much time left, so I'm going to try to be quick. There was a note about the reproduction, reflection, and symmetry, and even representation in the double meaning that Marx explores in the 18th of Brumaire of Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, Vertretung and Darstellung, were left behind as somehow ineffective ways to approach politics and life. And this was an aesthetic as much as an ethic decision. In Alice is the Devil, we can read a confession written by Bifo while he was in prison. I quote him, "I have attacked something. I have made a terrorist attack against something," in reality he says in Italian. "I must confess, against the separateness of life from desire, against sexism in inter-individual relationships, against the reduction of life to a remunerated service. But then they should say clearly, Dada terrorizes the grey, obtuse, dangerous guardians of the order of exploitation and misery. Transversal writing that recomposes the isolated behavior, it's not only obscene for them, it's a crime. What Dada theorized and wasn't able to realize, transversalism will be able to do, abolishing the separateness between sign and life, unleashing the significant subject, not anymore in the illusory space of art, but in the scandalous one of practice." End of the quote of Bifo. So what is interesting is that the program is truly the realization of art through a reading and writing of reality that allows the recomposition of behaviors that appear as separate, as unpolitical refuser of the order. So these transversalist aspects of Mao Dadaism stems from a long operaist tradition of rehabilitation of several sorts of devious behavior, in particular the refusal of work, absenteeism, expropriation, and the philosophy of the immediacy and the revolution of daily life, of course. A firm refusal of moralist politics that had characterized the Italian Communist Party. There was a funny slogan from '77 about austerity politics that can be translated as "sacrifices aren't enough, now we have to immolate ourselves." And there was a need to take a distance from patriarchy and the traditionally dignified image of the communist worker that Maoism, of course, was strongly veiculating, and that went towards a defunctionalized idea of the revolt. The ideology of efficiency, mirroring the one of power, was rejected. The Dada component of Mao Dadaism was used in a very original way, because this name flirted with the history of the artistic avant-garde, but claimed to abolish the difference between life and art. In one of Pablo Echauren's drawings from the time, we can read, "Revolution is already made," meaning many things, but amongst others that it's something that it's already there. It doesn't have an author, but needs an activator. Sensitive to its inframance quality, it needs to be at the same time defunctionalized and re-enchanted. So this aesthetic component of re-enchantment of the grey, depressing, sickening reality of exploitation takes the form of playfulness, against the rehabilitation of desire, creative language and creative actions based on a philosophy of immediacy rather than a program that eternally delays joy. It's essentially a message that I find useful today because it had the courage of refusing a responsibility that we can't bear, saying we are not represented, so we're not going to take this upon us because it's not our fault. And life is beautiful.
Thank you. Claudia.
Eso si sente. I also want to thank Jesus Velasco, Bernard Harcourt, Anna Kratauer, and all the you who came so generously to listen to us. I think I would like to say something starting from the film we saw yesterday night. That was La Chinoise by Godard, a film that was shooted, I think, in 1967, and in a very particular moment of French life, but also European life, and possibly also the entire globe life. I think in that particular moment, Godard was particularly far-sighted with his film. First, he made the film 1 year after the starting of the Cultural Revolution. Then 1 year before the Paris 68. So what was evident in the film was this group of 5 people, 5 students, were enthusiastic of a lot of things, were writing on the walls of their house, and what I think they were participant or symbolic scene of the political test for dialectic that was going on at that time, in particular for French philosophy. After 20th Congress of the Communist Party in Soviet Union, 1956, in political life, most of the communists felt a terrible bewilderment, and this bewilderment was felt particularly by Mao himself, but also keeping the side of French philosophy, also by the most important philosopher. So Mao was very critical since the very beginning of what was happening in the socialist country, like Soviet Union. That was up to that moment the brother country was followed as in part as an example, not completely. Mao was also suspicious about the Soviet line since the very beginning of the 30s. But his way of understanding what's going on was really something that crucially hit himself. He started questioning socialism. What was a socialist state? Why a socialist state? What should do a communist party? The French philosopher actually had very similar questions. What was at stake was the entire political culture under the name of Marxism, Marxism-Leninism. So dialectic was the clue. Stalin had the idea of a worldview, and so he divided dialectic in the two sides of materialist and materialism and historical materialism and dialectical materialism, and because of his vision of the world, he also cut in some way the possibility for other way of thinking dialectics. Why Althusser was so interested in Mao? So also, I believe, because of the kind of questions that Mao was posing. In particular, I wrote something in my blog, but I think one main point was he was very interested in the idea, in Mao's idea of the unequal development of each contradiction in each process. Then he was strongly interested in the idea of that in contradiction there is a principal contradiction and a secondary contradiction, but they can change place. So a secondary contradiction can become a principal one. So every process could transform into its opposite. I think these three elements, together with the analysis of the contradiction that Mao has done since 1936 and that he developed in 1957, and he went on with other research, but not after the 1960s. He didn't go on in philosophical writing. So he was not so intensely convinced of the strong relationship between philosophy and politics. In some way, if in the first writings he was separating, but in some way the politics was under the influence of philosophy, something happened after, in the 60s. So he considered completely differently this matter. So there is another aspect that I think is important, is this idea of the two, the two without one. That was the two aspects of the contradiction, but without the idea of the one. So I wrote, I sketched a bit in the blog about the idea of the one divided into two, that Althusser and another Chinese philosopher demonstrate that anyway it goes back to the one. So what I think is very important is to underline the idea that why the two is without one. So it's very enriching for those who have studied Mao literary text, philosophical text, and also political and military text, to find out that in some way he was influenced and he tried to go beyond this traditional idea of yin and yang. Yin and yang are the two aspects of masculine and feminine, and Lacan has demonstrated that there do exist a void between the two. And it is from the void that they are two and not one. So I think is paradoxically that he was influenced by Taoism. In Yang is the cosmogony of Chinese tradition of thought. But Mao didn't go on that. He was going in another direction, and in some way also I would dare to say that if he would know the understanding of Lacan of the intermediate void, he would appreciate it. In fact, there is a famous sentence by Mao about the knowledge of a couple and how it is difficult to be two of a couple, that he says, bu an, so it's disquieting. There is no peace. There is no possibility of overimposing one to each other or confusing the two. I think the intermediate void is a very important suggestion coming from Lacan to understand better also Mao's dialectic. I was in time?
Yes. Microphone, okay. I thank Bernal, Harcourt, Jesus Velasco, and Krataumer for organizing everything, you for inviting me. I am very glad to be here with you, with all of you, for sharing some thoughts about this immense topic, Mao and insurgency. We can discuss for hours, maybe for months, about this topic. I have some notes that are written on a Clare Fontaine textbook. We can ask them to sponsor our seminar, maybe.
I think it's a good idea.
Okay, and of course I have my little red book. If someone can ask, I can consult this and give the right answer. So, well, I have written something on the blog. I don't want to repeat anything of what I already written. I would, well, yes, closer, yes. Well, the problem of rethinking Mao today is the problem of how rethinking the Cultural Revolution is the main problem. And the Cultural Revolution is definitely the most enigmatic event, political event of the 20th century. So the problem is just to limit to a very concise formulation. The most obscure is the role of the masses in politics. Why is it so obscure? And of course, this obscurity is connected with the obscurity of the Cultural Revolution. It is definitely since the Cultural Revolution, and more precisely since the lack of a political and a theoretical assessment of the Cultural Revolution, that the problem of the role of masses in politics has become obscure. Of course, if you don't accept the idea that the role of mass of politics, the electoral role, and to participate to election, etc. So the nub of this obscurity is definitely the relationship between the masses. A term that Mao liked very much to use was a typical term of Maoist political theory, and the class-based vision of politics. I know that the issue is very problematic, and when we talk about radical politics, the idea that everything should be connected to a class-based division is sort of undisputable tenet, maybe. Well, the famous definition by Lenin, the masses are divided in classes, and the classes are represented by the parties, was finally the synthesis of the entire ideological and organizational framework of politics in the 20th century. But exactly this framework that enters in a radical turbulence in the long 60s, and in particular in their epicenter, their Chinese epicenter in the Cultural Revolution. So the most obscure problem with the Cultural Revolution, the greatest obstacle for a possible political and theoretical assessment is how to analyze the Cultural Revolution, its origins, its developments, in terms of classes. What class struggle was at the core of the Cultural Revolution. It's very difficult to give a clear answer to this question. Masses were certainly present in the Cultural Revolution. It was especially in the first 2 years, but in the entire decade, in the entire revolution decade, the masses were very active. In particular, in the first 2 years, as everyone knows, there were thousands of independent organizations, mass organizations. They were at a certain distance from the party, also very critical toward the party, etc. So the masses, the presence of the masses is clear, but how to make a class analysis of their existence during the Cultural Revolution, how to make a class analysis of the Cultural Revolution, in particular of the role of the masses. As well known, the first Marxist text by Mao is the analysis of classes in the Chinese society and their attitude toward the revolution, 26. Mao wrote other texts before, but this is considered his first Marxist text, and is also the first text in his collected works. So it's significant that his starting point as a Marxist leader was the analysis of classes, and for sure, the class analysis was an extraordinarily important tool, a compass in Mao's strategy during the People's War. But he did not write a class analysis of the Cultural Revolution. And he did not write an analysis of classes of Chinese society after 49. This is significant, I think. Of course, the reference to class struggle was omnipresent for Mao. But for sure, the relation between masses, class, and party entered in an unsolvable impasse with the Cultural Revolution, and Mao was fully aware of this. So it's important to remind that in the last 2 years of the decade, that was also the 2 years of his life, his main concern was how to make a political assessment of the events. And there are two main moves that he made in the last 2 years in order to find a way out of this impasse, how to analyze politically and theoretically what happened. The first initiative was a conceptual rethinking of the entire ideological organizational experience of Marxism, concentrated in his central concept, the dictatorship of the proletariat, absolutely. In the 74s, the late 74, Mao launched a theoretical campaign. It's not very, well, it's something only for specialists to know that the last 2 years of Cultural Revolution were marked by a strong theoretical tension about the question of what the dictatorship really is. Because it's interesting that this campaign, this theoretical campaign, was just a question mark. No? It's strange. Here in the Little Red Book, we have many affirmations, no? But that directive was just a question. Why did Lenin say dictatorship over the bourgeoisie? This question is not clear at all over the bourgeoisie. No. Mao said this question is not clear at all. It was the first Marxist leader to say that the dictatorship of proletariat was not clear at all. But you know, dictatorship of proletariat was not simply a form of state. It was the pivotal concept of the entire revolutionary episteme, Marxist episteme. No, it was not simply a form of state. It implied a lot of concepts, economy, politics, history, etc. And he said also that it was necessary a large mass discussion on this issue for find a clarification. It should be clarified. And without such clarification, it was very probable that socialism could evolve peacefully into capitalism. Well, this was a right prediction because the clarification was not made, and the capitalism has been established in China. Mao said often, it's very easy to make capitalism in China. He even said that except for the form of ownership between capitalism and socialism, there are not so many differences. I quote, it's not my interpretation. Literally, he said that there are not many differences. There was something of capitalism that socialism was forced to even to preserve. You know? So one of the great, the penultimate of his initiative was to rethink, to reconsider the entire framework of theory of socialism, starting from Marx, Lenin. In this theoretical campaign was not included Stalin. This maybe is not, they did not forget him. They tried to overcome the Stalin vision of dictatorship proletariat. And it was absolutely necessary for him to make such an assessment of the entire ideological tradition in order to make a political assessment of the Cultural Revolution. So the last initiative was exactly to try to launch a campaign on the mistakes of the Cultural Revolution. There's very few people know that the last act of Mao was to propose in 75, in autumn 75, proposed a mass campaign not on the Cultural Revolution in general, but on what did not work in the Cultural Revolution. Did not, the mistakes of the Cultural Revolution. He did not say anything else. He did not say we must make a class analysis of Cultural Revolution. He said only the Cultural Revolution, there are many people that do not agree, but for different reasons. Somebody have been treated unjustly, they have been vexed, so we must listen to their grievances. And other people will just have a vengeance against their critics. So he invited everybody to have a, he used the term that in Chinese is used for scholarly research. We must research Cultural Revolution. No? And it's interesting that he did not use any class reference to launch this year. And of course, he was not able to realize this project because the entire leading group of the Communist Party was against this, starting from Deng Xiaoping. I maintain that the victory of Deng Xiaoping was based on his capacity to block this initiative of making an assessment of cultural revolution. Because we can discuss this in detail, but in any case, he was absolutely against, and the entire leading elite was against. So when Mao, it was the last tentative to discuss the destiny of socialism with the party. And after this refusal, Mao made his last political thesis. The last political thesis that, of course, produced a hostility, a total hostility, and a durable hostility of the Communist Party toward him. Because his last thesis is the most obscure, I quote, or more or less, the most obscure point in socialism is where is the bourgeoisie? No? We make the social revolution and we do not know where the bourgeoisie is. And he gave an answer, not a question. The bourgeoisie is in the party, is just within the party, and is stressed just within the party. 就在党内 Chinese is very strong. So we are definitely at the antipodes to the Lenin thesis. You know? Masses are divided into classes, and classes are represented by the parties. You know? The bourgeoisie is in the party. So what are classes exactly? He even said that part of a working class was in the bourgeoisie in this sense, and we can also technically discuss in which sense he said that the working class was part of the governmental circumstances of the socialism, because it was inscribed in socialism in a special way. And so the end of Cultural Revolution was an unfinished assessment, definitely unfinished. So now we are. It's very difficult to find a way, to find a road to reopen the dossier of the Cultural Revolution, except in terms of horror. But you can say the same of French Revolution. If you talk about horror, we are finished to discuss the issue of revolution. What I propose is that in order to reopen a political assessment of cultural revolution, to consider its origins, its developments, its novelties, its tragedies, errors, etc., in the perspective of a great political laboratory, mass laboratory, whose main experimental terrain, as immense as unfinished, was the intellectual and political value of the entire horizon of class-based revolutionary vision of politics. I stop here, and I hope that there will be discussion on such controversial issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Does it work at all? Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. I am going to give to ask Jeremy to give a couple of comments and to perhaps ask some questions, and I'll ask some of my own later. But in the meantime, please, Jeremy.
So thank you all very much. Thank you all for coming. It's quite a turnout, and thank you to Bernard and Jesus, as always, for organizing these incredibly stimulating events, and to all of our speakers for coming such a distance. I guess what I thought I would do quite very briefly is to try to narrow the gap a bit. Bernard started us off by situating the movement from the first meeting on Marx to this meeting on Mao. and there is undoubtedly a huge distance conceptually, chronologically, and geographically between those two figures. And the speakers, I thought, have done a beautiful job of illustrating several aspects of both Mao and the Maoist reception in the West, several aspects that truly do seem novel and to challenge traditional Marxist conceptions. That said, I guess what I thought I wanted to do was therefore push back a bit on the specificity of Mao, or in the hopes not of denying the specificity, but of rather further clarifying what is really new in Mao, at least qua Marx and qua the sort of general trajectory of the seminar series. The first point to make in that regard is, in going from Marx to Mao, we have, there are several other names that I think help to bridge that gap, many of whom were Mao's contemporaries, and all of whom I think were dealing with really a very related set of questions to the questions that Mao was forced to confront. And so perhaps the most obvious names, although one could fill in the list in all sorts of different ways, would be Lenin, Trotsky, Gramsci, Bodiga, Lukács, Guevara, specifically on issues of military strategy in the revolution. But those, Luxemburg, did I mention? Trotsky, Luxemburg, Gramsci, Lukács, Bodiga. Any event, just as a smattering of names. And I actually think that all of those thinkers and political actors were dealing, of course, not with the same conditions that Mao was confronted with in China. But I think they all can be understood with Mao in confronting a real situation that exceeded in all of their minds the roadmap that they found in Marx. And this is not to slight Marx, but just to, it's going to be very reductive, but what I would say is what all of these thinkers have in common is they are dealing with A, the recognition of the combined and uneven development of capitalism in the starting in the late 19th and into the 20th century. And B, they are thinking about what is the proper relationship between the organization of the Revolutionary Party and the capitalist state under the conditions of the combined and uneven development of global capitalism. Once that very reductive problematic is put on the table, I think one starts to see more similarities than differences in many of the questions and several of the answers that Maoist political thought developed when compared to Lenin, Trotsky, Lukács, Gramsci, Bodiga, Luxemburg. And I'll just flag 3, because I think the points of agreement and disagreement are helpful in thinking about both the reception of Mao and more generally the post-68 world and the world we inhabit today. So in a way, what I am trying to do, I guess, is sort of recover the orthodoxy of Mao vis-a-vis a basic conception of revolutionary politics. So vis-a-vis, so the three categories I'll throw out are the revolutionary context, the revolutionary party, and the validity or possibility of revolution itself. So in terms of the revolutionary context, what I mean basically are the question of what are the necessary and or sufficient conditions for revolution. I think all of the thinkers I have mentioned who occupy this this first half or even first two-thirds of the 20th century, almost immediately recognize that under conditions of combined and uneven development of global capitalism, the revolutionary context will not simply be the existence of a sufficiently organized and conscious industrial proletariat. This was not a discovery of Mao's. This is obviously core to some of Lenin's earliest writings. And so from Lenin in the very beginning of the 20th century to the mid-70s Mao, I actually think there is a great deal of continuity in recognizing that whatever one thinks about class composition in a given society, the revolutionary context is not simply the sufficient organization and consciousness of the industrial proletariat. It will involve class coalitions. It will involve, it may involve geographically unevenly distributed revolutionary fractions that are composed of one or more classes, and so forth. So hearing Alessandro talk about the role of class in Mao, I mean, it's fascinating the dates you gave us, 26, 49, and then the Cultural Revolution, the disappearance of class analysis in Mao's thought. You know, be that as it may, the more general insight that a peasant's war is a potential path to revolution, or that there may be many different actors engaged in the revolutionary process, sourced from different class backgrounds or backgrounds that are not exhausted by class analysis, I would actually say is not seriously challenged by any of these major Marxist thinkers of the first half of the 20th century. The second point, the Revolutionary Party and its proper organization, here, I think, is where the true uniqueness of Mao lies, and Alessandro is just picking up right off where Alessandro left us. The enigma of the Cultural Revolution and the going much farther than other critiques, Trotskyist, and other critiques of the problem of bureaucratic organization within the Revolutionary Party. Mao develops a unique theory of revolution within the party, to the point of, in the mid-70s, at least in his own context, placing the bourgeoisie within the party itself. And then finally, the third category, the validity of revolution itself. Here, I'll just very loosely define revolution as a rupture leading from one mode of production to another, and over the course of which the state will either be radically transformed or will disappear. I do not think any of those thinkers I've named abandon the belief and the validity of revolution in that sense. So I'll just leave it there and happy to, I guess, in the form of a question to the speakers, and in terms of Fulvia, I've thought a lot about, you know, where does the coming insurrection and where do works that come out of contemporary French radical politics stand in regards to those three categories. I mean, there I actually think we see, I would say we see orthodoxy on the first point, orthodoxy on the third point, and Tikkun and the Invisible Committee and a number of other radical European leftist organizations. On the second point, the question of the Revolutionary Party, are deeply critical and have even abandoned the party form, call for an abandonment of the party form that goes beyond even Mao's problematization of the party as actually the site of internal revolution. But I guess to both Claudia and Alessandro then, who are the Mao experts, and I am certainly not one, I would also be curious as to this account of the orthodox, all that is orthodox in Mao, and how that might distinguish Mao's thought into his death from the Maoist reception in Western Europe, South America, and the United States, where I think it combines with many, many other currents, Trotskyism, anarchism, on and on. And I think the Maoist reception outside of China will often break with more of those points than Mao himself did, including the validity of revolution itself. So I'd be just curious to hear reactions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So why don't we take a first round of comments on these questions and general commentaries. Jeremy, thank you very much, Jeremy. So,
do I start?
Yes.
Okay. So, yeah, thank you very much for these questions that are really useful in terms of resituating the debate that actually is so polluted by a lack of historicization, and I wouldn't have helped on that side myself, but I warned you at least. I will reply to the specific question because there is a very important point in there, which is the abandonment of the party form, and I would like to trace a little genealogy of this position, which is at the same time a political position and a philosophical position. And the genealogy of this position comes from the Italian autonomy and the operaism in particular, and from the analysis that were conducted through the Conricerca and through other organs of militant research by Alquati and Tronti especially, on the dissolution of the subject through the concept of class composition, in the sense that the fact that the subjective component, in particular in the revolt of Piazza Statuto, didn't correspond, didn't match. Yeah, it's the ancestor of 68. It was our, foundational moment, our prophetic moment of our history. I assume everybody knows it, but maybe it's important to remind it. Yeah. So these people in the street that rioted for several days did not correspond to the image of class that the Communist Party had. So from there on, there's been this analysis by Azor-Rosa of the two societies that is exactly the opposite of what I've said in my paper, that just, goes for the ecstatic, happy, and joyful, and irresponsible, and interesting part of the movement of 77, which is the one involved in our own concept of human strike that was already in Tikkun 1 and 2. Sorry. But essentially, this theory of the two society by Azor-Rosa was that there was one society that was, the good one, the good revolutionary, the good proletarians, and the other society that was the improductive, absentees, semi-criminal, etc., etc., all these subjects that, the plebs in the Louis Napoleon Bonaparte text, etc., etc. So actually, there is a reading, a very interesting reading of the class composition composed by this part of the population of the proletarians that is also a part of the self, and that's where the Italian theory is really inventive, because they conceive, and in that sense, they go beyond Mao's conclusion that the bourgeoisie is inside the party, that the bourgeoisie is inside us. So from there on, there is a real, how would I say, conception of the revolutionary process, which is based on types of organization and structures that try not to crystallize hierarchy, because 77, I would like to remind it also as a historical fact, was born out of the criticism of the group's dynamics. We had the most powerful, the strongest non-Stalinist Communist Party of Europe and nearly of the Western world. And nevertheless, it was oppressing the workers, it was stopping revolutions, and it ended up with the historical compromise, the strategy of tension that, I would put on the account of the historical compromise, etc., etc. So, and the unions weren't doing a very good job. It's the least we can say. So there was this crisis manifesting itself, and 77 was response to this crisis that we should, I think, take very seriously in terms of the promise it gave, because it wasn't only this jolly and inspiring and poetic thing that I have focused upon, but it was also a solution to a problem that was the problem of composing the existential plan and the political plan, which was something that no force at work was doing, and was turning into something very tragic, very counter-revolutionary, and destroying, creating an implosion in the forces that were at work. And on this, of course, the feminist movement played an immense role, as a new way of conceiving politics, as a new horizon, profoundly anti-dialectic again, and profoundly centered on a conception of subjectivity that I wouldn't say let aside class, because class was really central in all this analysis, but saw it in a different way, from a different angle, and conceived this new complexity of, that also the anti-psychiatric movement, I think it's part of the same conceptual and political movement of recomposing these two plans that parties and the constituted powers are constantly trying to separate, and by doing so blocking, the natural evolution of a revolutionary process that was at work. And as we know, just the last thing I say, this movement of '77 ended up in a major repression, major repression with thousands and thousands of arrests and torture and exile, etc., etc. So this was a political decision that was made, and I don't like to talk about this part of this history, because it's unfortunately not interesting, because then there's the whole debate on dissociation, etc. But this completely cut the fragility and the vital importance of this laboratory, of this theoretical and political promise that existed there, and that we really need to rethink today, urgently, I think, not to find ourselves again stuck into the thing. And the last thing, I made a note on that. There are two very different conceptions of the party in the text by the Invisible Committee and the text by Tikkun. Of course, there is a movement, an internal movement in both of the things, in the several texts of the Invisible Committee and the two issues of Tikkun. But in Tikkun, there is this concept that is very interesting and comes from this autonomy analysis of the class composition, which is this concept of the imaginary party that prefigurates in many, many ways the problems that we are having now with the definition of terrorism and the repression of terrorism, where every left-wing extra-parliamentary action enters, under the, not only in the States, but also in France and in Italy, etc., under the jurisdiction that treats it as a criminal action. It's a crime. It's no longer a political action recognized. So the whole structure of democracy is threatened by this imaginary party that is something that, it's a concept that comes from Le Lèvres Nues to begin with, but it's completely re-elaborated there. And I would say this is a big difference from the idea of the Invisible Committee that, on the other side, falls back, at least in the first text. Now in the last one, I wouldn't say so, but comes back on this idea of activism and recomposing a moving party that is semi-clandestine. I find it really completely regressive, personally. So it's difficult to turn on your mic.
Sorry. I feel like the question of class is, first of all, when he says that the bourgeoisie is in the party, means the party is in the bourgeoisie. So it's not true that he quit the analysis of classes, but he ended his life on this, trying to do exactly the last kind of analysis of classes. What happens after is something that we all know, what happened in 1989. in '89 happened something very strong, a disaster. But how to define the classes that were in insurgency? There were all sorts of people in the square, all sorts of people. And very difficult to say they belong to one class or to the other. What I think is, was relevant was that there were done a lot of mistakes from in the side. I would say strategically mistakes from the side of the students. So they didn't unite with the workers, and the workers were in the square. They didn't, they wanted to stay at the center just to use the media, that they're still going around with journalism because Gorbachev was already there and was just gone, but still a lot of journalists. I think there was a big mistake because they should have gone in the margin and get the entire, they could have spread all over the country. On the contrary, they wanted the center. So the center is the easiest place to grasp, even in the Go. So the traditional Weiqi place of Czechs, Chinese Czechs, is the weakest point. Mm-hmm. Then that's another problem. Which classes were in insurgency? Then at that time, the category of revolution has already shifted on another level. Paradoxically, that it seems horrible, but it was a toothpaste revolution. You can have a white, bright smile if you use our revolutionary toothpaste. And that was. Then another, I really would like to remember something about '77, which was also something that very contradictory. He can say also and answer in some way to what Fulvia said. It's true that there were very big confusion about what was a party, the nature of the party, but the party, the Chinese party and the other parties were other things. So the idea of the party for Mao changed slowly after the 1949. Slowly, because his idea of party was a party of struggle and liberation of the people. But once the party becomes a state party, or party state, so the nature, the very nature has changed. So he has to he had to deal with this also after the 20th Congress. That was very acute, the idea, what was a party doing? In Italy, in '77, the party has sent the union with the tanks. The same as that was done in '89. So probably Deng Xiaoping learned from '77. So that was something scaring. So I don't want to go on this, but that was the idea of the class. It's very difficult to say what was class in the very moment of the biggest insurgency in China, at the end of 20th century.
Some remark on class, but very theoretical, a bit dogmatic, if you want. I don't want to engage in any phenomenological analysis of classes, how they've changed, etc. Lenin said that every cultivated bourgeois scholar could accept, must accept the idea that society is organized in classes. The touchstone of a true Marxist was, for Lenin, the dictatorship of the proletariat. This is the basic for Lenin. In State and Revolution, when he criticized Bernstein, Kautsky, etc., he defended the idea that the crucial issue of the concept of class and class struggle was the dictatorship of the proletariat. So I stress so much the importance of the last debate of the Cultural Revolution about the real content of the dictatorship of the proletariat. We can go on with classes, but classes has not been invented by Marx. Marx said himself that he had not invented classes, that classes have been invented by French discovered, not invented by, in a sense also invented by French historians, by bourgeois economists. No, Guizot was the one of the first to Guizot, Mignet, Thierry. They made a class analysis of the French Revolution. They said there was a good French Revolution that was led by middle class, and the bad French Revolution that was led by the multitude. They used the multitude before Negri. Well, also Ricardo used the class. So the class is something that Marx himself said, I am not discovered a class, I have discovered that the classes are historically determined, and my contribution is the dictatorship of the proletariat, the same. So the kernel of the problem of class is not how to make a better and more refined class analysis. Classes do exist. This is not the problem. Classes are the condition of modern forms of government. The ancien regime were the orders, and the classes are more mobile, more instable parts of society. So in this sense, classes has been invented by bourgeois historian and economist. Marx added something that was totally different from the idea of Guizot, and not by chance Guizot ended his career in 1948 when the multitude emerged not as a specter but as a political reality in trying to organize themselves, etc. And when Marx and Engels innovated the class-based vision that was basically a bourgeois vision of politics, transforming into a politics of liberation and abolition of classes, as he said. So this is our problem now. How to understand classes. Classes do exist. There are social differences, social inequalities, but also forms of governing the society. And how to understand classes after the turbulence that invested the concept and the reality of the dictatorship of the proletariat. So in this sense, I say the Cultural Revolution was very paradoxical, because which were the classes during the Cultural Revolution? The most paradigmatic event in the Cultural Revolution was the Shanghai January Revolution in January '67. There were 1 million workers on one side and 1 million workers on the other side. So there was a split, a conceptual split in the working class, because for the 1 million of scarlet girls, as they called themselves, they were the supporters of government. The figure of working class was fully inscribed in the socialist state, was a part of socialist state. For the revolutionary rebels, the workers, the working class, they also used the term working class, but could exist beyond the party state. They wanted to be recognized as a revolutionary organization, although not belonging to the party state. So this event is a crucial event in the Marxist, in the revolutionary conception of class and class struggle, because the very working class was crossed by a conceptual dilemma on what was the role of working class in the socialism. And the socialism was conceived as the realization of the condition of liberation of working class. So this is the problem, one of the obscurity of analyzing cultural revolution in terms of class struggle. And this is, well, is our weakness, I must say.
Thank you very much. Do you want to say something? Why don't we take some questions and some comments from the audience?
Yeah. Let's do that. And also, though, I do want to kind of emphasize as we pose these questions, as we think about these issues, that we kind of maintain a close frame on kind of what are the differences in this particular modality of uprising, right? Which is so we need to kind of, I don't know, maybe concretize some of the discussion about the different ways of thinking about class as they relate specifically to how insurgency or insurrection becomes reconceptualized and differently conceptualized. And so, of course, we've touched on a lot of this, which has to do in part with the relationship with the party, right, and internal fragmentation, et cetera. But I just want to make sure that we kind of stay focused on this question of modalities of uprising and how things change in that way.
If I can add a remark about Mao's attitude toward insurgency and revolt, etc., and the relation with classes. It's since the beginning for Mao, the revolt, the insurgency, etc., was a condition, an unavoidable condition of the appearance of masses in politics. And was since the beginning was distincted from class. It was compatible, but was not the same. No. On the one side, was not simply the disorder for the sake of the disorder. The idea of Mao, Lord of Misrule, is totally misunderstanding. Was a sort of joke. But also, uprising was not a mean for example, seizing of power, etc., was not exactly. The disorder, the tumult was something immanent to the social body. But Mao was not the first to recognize it. If you look back to Machiavelli in the discourses on the first 10 books of Tito Livio, he warns the Italian princes, saying, but the tumult is everywhere. No, you cannot do without the tumult. So the tumult is omnipresent in the social life. No? So, and Mao, on one side, was was something similar to Machiavelli, but on the other side, he said that the insurgency, the turbulence, the disorder were compatible with a class analysis. Up to the 49 and maybe later, he was convinced that the insurgency and the class analysis were the two aspects of his strategy. With the Cultural Revolution, was not possible to go on this compatibility. This is you want to be more concrete, you ask to be more concrete, so I make this periodization. Up to a certain moment, class and mass disorders were the two aspects of strategy. After 68, Mao was much more critical. I have commented the last meeting with Red Guards. Of course, Mao was very, he tried to understand the students, but he was totally critical of their revolt and the little civil war that they were doing in China in that moment. So this is the passage between 66 and 68. It changes concretely. You ask to be concrete. It changes concretely the relation between the masses, the insurgency, the revolt, the tumult, and the possibility to inscribe this disorder in a rationality, a reason, not the reason of the rebellion. No? After 68, Mao was convinced that to understand the mass disorder, the very framework of the previous reason of the revolution should be rethought deeply. And this is just to try to give a tentative answer to your question.
So we're taking questions from the audience? Please, Rick.
Yes, I would the whole idea of uprising in Mao's thought is in the writings you have that I guess you selected of Mao. You know, when he's doing the investigations in the 20s, he's actually rejecting the ideas of the Comintern, which have been a failure in China, that is mass urban uprisings. So I think one has to rehistoricize what is the conditions of his thought. Secondly, you mentioned People's War once. We're not, you know, his contribution to revolution is the idea of People's War in a main. It's not uprisings. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think is the impact of the Vietnam War on the Cultural Revolution? Because China has 150,000 troops fighting in Vietnam. They have another 100,000 on the border ready to intervene if we invade. How is that interacting in a concrete way? Because that, of course, is much more important than, you know, La Chinoise.
Should we take a few? Jesus, are we taking other people? Questions? Yes. Right there in the glasses.
Hello. I guess this is for the panel more generally, but I guess building off of that last question, I was wondering if the panel could talk more about the relation to anti-imperialism and Mao's concept of insurrection, particularly given you know, the party's kind of rise through anti-Japanese struggle.
Yeah, thank you. So it was a remark to go in the sense of what Clare Fulton said about every leftist extra-parliamentary action being actually potentially treated as an action of terrorism. And this is also because it's not really terrorism that is looked for in the definition in French law. It's even much more broader than that. It's a person in respect to whom there are substantial grounds for believing that his or her conduct constitutes a threat to public security and order. This is the actual state of emergency law enacted right now. So actually, not only this definition applies to much more than what we call international terrorism, but also the idea of action is much broader because you don't really have to act. It's sufficient to believe that in somehow, some way, someday you're going to act. And this is what happened for environmental activists during the COP21 in 2015. And this is maybe, so to come back to the focusing that Bernard asked us to, so it's not maybe about modalities of uprising, but it's about modalities of preventing uprising, because it's actually putting the public order as a standard, and everything else is potentially an uprising, and thus subject to this preventive counter-revolution that Etienne Balibar spoke about in the last seminar. So maybe uprising is everything that is a potential threat to public order, and then so everything is a potential, you know, it's potentially subject to a counter or a preemptive counter-revolution measure, and that's what is happening.
And one more question. And then we'll do another round.
Mine is perhaps a bit off the focus, but maybe bringing it through the chain to a more maybe contemporary question, or a question is what are the stakes for our contemporary interpretation of specifically 77. And it's perhaps about the question of technology that got me spinning, and about looking beyond the mirror, and how perhaps the problem of accounting for multiplicity in the dialectic, or beyond the applied dialectic perhaps, becomes a problem of perspective, and thinking about these new kind of social individuals that emerged from 77, and perhaps like desires in general behind cultural revolutions in general, and about identifying the bourgeoisie in us. My question is, how do we perhaps balance this combined and uneven development that we're talking about? And it seems to me that it's about identifying perhaps the particularity of a situation, even if given by as much chance or accident as any other, as you will, and willingly give it more weight on a daily basis. So the particularity of a situation of injustice I'm speaking about, and willingly giving it more weight on a daily basis. And as far as technology now, it seems to me that has given us the ability to identify such particularities and making it part of a broader algorithm. So now we're able to have both the top-down and bottom-up perspectives at the same time and within the same structure. And, well, it got me thinking of yesterday we watched La Chinoise, and there's this particular image of the radio gun, the radio that turns into a gun. And that for me is the kind of like Brechtian gestus, or like image of 77, in a certain sense, really crystallizes it. And I'm wondering if anyone has any ideas of what is our image. Because the radio gun seems like it doesn't really pertain as much to 2017 as part of the dated part of it. The movie.
Thank you. Shall I just rehearse the 4 points? I mean, folks are going to answer, but just very quickly, we've heard, just to remind our speakers, several historically rooted questions about Maoist critique of the Comintern, People's War as a uniquely Maoist innovation, and the impact of the Vietnam War on the Cultural Revolution. Second, we had a question about anti-imperialism and the role of the relationship between Maoist thought and anti-imperialism, both then and going forward in time. Third, the question, I know I'm being reductive, of perhaps we shouldn't, the issue is not what kind of insurrections or what kind of uprisings are politically salient or possible today, but rather the real focal point should be that we live in an age where modalities of preventing uprising or insurrection are essentially leading the historical moment. And that nicely pairs with the fourth question, the degree to which technology is both allowing, I would think, those sorts of modalities of policing, of suppressing insurrection, but also potentially ways of highlighting a multiplicity of injustices that constitute today's society. Choose what you like.
The first question is the more complicated, the role of Vietnam War, the impact of Vietnam War on the Cultural Revolution, because it's complicated on two sides. On one side, of course, for Mao, the Vietnam War and was prolonging his idea of people's war, so they supported Vietnam. The thorny issue was the relation with the Soviet Union, because also Soviet Union supported the North Vietnam. So a great problem, a very complicated problem in 65, and probably something that also accelerated the decision of the Cultural Revolution by Mao, was the tendency of reestablishing relationship between the Chinese Communist Party and the Soviet Union in the name of the anti-imperialism that Mao considered very ambiguous in that moment. If it is true also, there is a memoir by an Italian secretary of the Communist Party for a short period, the last secretary of Communist Party was called Achille Occhetto, a sort of Romulus Augustus of the Italian Communist Party, that in 65 was a delegation of Italian communist youth in Vietnam and passed through Peking, and Deng Xiaoping told him, Italian comrades, you know, we are going to make a strong alliance with Soviet Union. We will destroy American imperialism. The world would have been totally different if this would happen. So luckily Mao opposed strongly to any alliance with the Soviet Union, and the difficulty was how to support the Vietnamese, even sending troops. You are right, totally right. There were Chinese troops in Vietnam without moderating the contrast with the Soviet Union. On the contrary, the contrast was even deeper. So this is a problem of Vietnam War. Probably Vietnam War was the last people's war, probably. This is difficult to say, but it's difficult now to see other forms of similar people's war. Probably we can analyze further the issue. The question of anti-imperialism, I suppose, is the question concerns the 30s and the Japanese invasion of China, etc. Was a very entangled moment of Chinese politics, because it was also the split between the communist and the Kuomintang, and this split was also one of the conditions that allowed the Japanese invasion of China, because and on the contrary, the victory of the Japan was also due to a new alliance between the communist and the Kuomintang. What I will say that anti-imperialism for Mao had never the form of a national identity. The anti-imperialism was in terms of universalism. No, there was not the Chinese against the Japanese, absolutely. No. It was the Chinese as one component of the world revolution. Absolutely, this was very important in the anti-Japanese. There was never the idea of, and on the contrary, paradoxically, the Japanese invaded China for defending the Chineseness. The Japanese attitude, they were terrible, worse than German Nazi in Italy. They invaded China and established also the Manchukuo, a regime with the old emperor at the service of Japanese imperialists, in the name of the Chinese identity. So the positions were on one side the identity of an Asian identity, Sinocentric, because for the Japanese, the great Asianism, this was the position of Japanese that allowed them to justify the imperialist aggression, and on the other side, a position that was totally universalist, was the proletarian internationalism. This was the anti-imperialism at that moment.
Okay, I would like to get Claudia and Fulvia into the conversation in response to the first round of questions, but Etienne suggested he has a quick follow-up on this specific point. Etienne, wait just a moment, please.
I was about asking the question in the form, when do you exactly date in time the Chinese, therefore, in fact, Mao's decision to shift alliance, however uneasy, with the Soviet Union against America to an alliance with America against the Soviet Union. But I can formulate it in a slightly different manner, referring to a very specific fact, which for all of us at the time had a devastating impact. This is when Mao approved the Pinochet coup in Chile. So anti-imperialism at that moment was very, very, very far.
Mao approved personally the Pinochet coup.
Well, the Chinese government unequivocally
approved the Chinese coup, the Pinochet coup. I must study better the Chinese history. I don't remember this.
That's why I resigned my subscription
the question
of
the alliance with the Americans. Mao offered to the Americans a way out from the Vietnam War that they had already lost, but in America, not in Vietnam. So there was a big debate in the Communist Party, and Mao was very active in this debate, if the Soviet Union was really the main enemy and was the main threat and Mao opposed this vision, and opposed was there was a huge debate, because at a certain moment Kissinger proposed really a very ambiguous alliance, proposing to the Chinese Republic, the People's Republic, to China to participate in the same satellite defense system. And Mao was absolutely contrary, and that was one of the reasons of the contrast with Zhou Enlai in 73, 74. So it's not so simple to say that Mao approved an alliance with America against the Soviet Union. The attitude of Mao was to be, in a certain sense, outside of the logic of the Cold War. Since the 53, if you want, the Bandung Conference, the idea of to be outside of the division of the war in two camps. And after 56, with the starting of the contrast with Soviet Union, this was the element of novelty of Chinese politics, to not to belong to one of the camps. This was very important. Even also in the film yesterday, this was important.
Alessandro, I don't mean to interrupt, but I am interrupting because we have limited time, and I would like to get Claudia and Fulvia.
Okay.
If you do not need to respond to any of the questions, we're going to collect another round. But if you have any. So then Fulvia.
Another round.
Well, Fulvia, why don't you respond?
Yeah, I'm just going to try to pick up what Eleonora said about the state of exception and the new definition of terrorism, which is also, with the intention of terrorizing the population, right? So the intention is very important because we come back to the Inquisition. So I believe that here, when we point out this problem of the counter-revolutionary measures that are widespread, I would say in Europe the tolerance, the level of repression towards political actions like left wing, especially. I mean, things aim to preserve the democratic process has dramatically increased. And it's incredible how difficult it seems to fight this. And I would say since 2001 this has happened. I would say, I mean, there are many books that have been published about this, but probably the Genova G8 in 2001 was a moment, like a milestone of the impotency of a movement that had reached some sort of peak, some sort of very important, size and relevance and a certain level of union and homogeneity, and wasn't able to face this level of repression. And I'm afraid we must go back to this analysis of the fragmentation of class and the change of composition of class, because the fact that the productive structure of society, post-Fordism and its evolution, etc., have deprived people of concrete opportunities of organizing themselves together on the ground in situations where they are, identifiable as, as having a clearly readable class position, being it professional or, socio-economically codified. This thing is absent. We've got to acknowledge that this thing is not absent. It's there and it's super oppressive, but it's extremely hard to organize and codify, etc. Especially within the background, this crisis of the party form and the group form that cannot be denied. We cannot come back on this, it would be worst. So I would say that this level of repression, this level of destruction of every state of right can be deployed only because there is a lack of capacity of recomposing like a subjectivity, a subversive subjectivity, collective subjectivity that is caused by these objective factors. And I want to come back on the question of Vered, what would be the symbol today. There is a huge problem with identity politics. I think that Angela Davis is very lucid about that, and when she talks about feminism, feminist abolitionism, and the fact that identity politics are not, meant to fold up on themselves, but they are an opening to, another example of recomposing this fragmentation. I think this is vital. So if I can imagine a symbol, I would say it would be the mobile phone that is used to film police brutality. I would say it's this idea of being awake, this technological wake that is present in the slogan of stay woke. It's this visionary idea that technology can be awake when we are not, and if they spy on us, if they, opacity is not enough. It's not a solution. Being clandestine, trying to be invisible, dissolving, it's not the solution. The solution is being present where horrors happen and opposing them with one's body. So it's a return of materialism, of the physical materialism. I mean, this idea of Preciado, of the parliament of the bodies in Documenta, I think it was that. I don't think it worked very well because of the structure of the event that is problematic in itself. But I think the key question is there, in my opinion.
I have two questions here. A gentleman here, but Bernard, do you want to answer?
I just want to jump in before, and we pass it around. So just to, this conversation is fascinating, and it's, but I just wanted to emphasize, and in part it was, there are four temporal moments here going on that we're kind of battling with, and they're kind of clashing at times and also not talking to each other at times, but there are really four temporal moments. I mean, we're talking in part about the Mao before 49, so we're talking about kind of the insurgent Mao that leads to the Chinese Civil War, etc. We're talking about the Cultural Revolution Mao. We're talking about the 77 Mao, or influenced Mao, and we're talking about the present also. And so, I mean, and so when we designed, when Jesus and I were putting together this session, we realized that there is a kind of complexity to the kind of, to trying to cover this terrain. But the idea in some point is, you know, to work with a history of the present, right? So, I mean, we wanted to move back. But I just want to emphasize that a lot of times these conversations are kind of jumping from one to the other, but they are related. It might have been pushing something on our part to kind of impose a Maoist-inspired nature to the coming insurrection, etc. I'm not sure, or to the more recent forms of uprisings. That could be part of the question of what we're trying to get at here in part, is to what extent are the recent manifestations, which for some of us are the ones that are dominating our minds right now, do they fit in this trajectory? Do they fit in this trajectory? Maybe ultimately they don't. I mean, and so when, for instance, you say the iPhone or the smartphone is the weapon today, right? I mean, there is a sense in which, okay, that makes total sense, but it's a far cry from the gun, right? And well, or not, I'm not sure. I mean, in any event, that's a question, or that's an issue in this kind of multiple staged history that we're going through right now. So
we have... I should have done this the first time. Please introduce yourself when you ask your question.
So, yeah, I'm Simona Forti, and I come from Bologna. And
nice to meet you.
yes. And so one part of my question was anticipated by Bernard, so I don't raise the same question. But in 1977, I wasn't already there, but almost. I was going to school, and in a few years I would have gone to Bologna. And Fulvia, Clare, correct me if I'm wrong and if I'm going to simplify too much your thought. The picture you made of 1977 is that it was a joyful and happy insurgence that was ended, stopped by repression, okay? So I think that the Italian situation was a bit more complicated at the time, and that you gave us maybe a too happy picture of that moment. And so I would like to ask you, if the repression wasn't there, how the 1977 could develop, according to you?
I'm Clara Mattei. I come from the New School. I would like to challenge a little bit what Claudia was proposing, which was the distinction between politics and philosophy within Mao's thoughts. I don't know much about Mao, but what I think is that there is a clear relation between dialectical materialism and the possibility of thinking and acting towards an insurrection. And especially I was thinking about how the particular interpretation of dialectical materialism that Mao is proposing in the readings we had on contradiction, it's actually about the fact that looking concretely at problems, you discover the internal contradictions, and thus the self-criticism of the party is actually, to me, deriving exactly from this historical materialist perspective. And so the point that Jeremy and Fulvia were making about how the heterodoxy of Mao stands out when he is critical about the role and the structure of the party, seems to me very much related to this philosophical approach he is proposing. So I'm also wondering, trying to, maybe relating to the question before me, how much is a dialectical materialist perspective useful also today to understand what are the weaknesses, internal weaknesses of these movements of insurrection.
Aurélie Vialette from Stony Brook University. So my comment and question has to do with what Alessandro Russo said about the role of the masses in politics and about this question of classes that was addressed before. And I want to go back to the text that some of the text that we had to read for today. And the interest and fascination that Mao had regarding the masses is very much in tune with what sociologists of his time were analyzing in Europe. I'm thinking of Gustave Le Bon, La Psychologie des Masses, and of this necessity to understand who the masses are and how to govern them and how do they react to different forms of leadership. I mean, for this reason, texts such as the report on an investigation of the peasant movement in Hunan highlight the need for first-hand knowledge of the masses. I mean, the vocabulary that Mao uses is very revealing. I mean, he says, I met all sorts of people, I made first-hand investigation, I'm a witness, I'm fact-finding. I mean, but I'd like to go to another text that was not assigned and that was addressed in the blogs, and especially by Jesus in his blog, and it's the Little Red Book that, to me, is like a second step of this thought about the masses and how to govern them. If the report and other texts really help Mao to understand the masses, the Little Red Book is directly directed at these masses. I mean, they are the ideal readership because it offers ready-made ideological solutions and interpretations of daily life, inscribing, and it describes itself in a long tradition of working-class manuals and little books that workers were able to have in their pockets, and this happened, in every industrialized countries, and it started in the 18th century, really, in England and throughout the 19th century. So my question is about the materiality of the transmission of Mao's interest for the masses, and about this step from a witness first-hand analysis of social, economic, and the educational situation of the peasants' masses to the need of transmitting a specific knowledge to these masses through a manual with aphorisms, actually more than allowing a self-education of the masses. On the contrary, through its publishing and dissemination mode, was more an instrument of, a tool of control of the masses, and so as to avoid insurgency of the masses, uprising, revolts. It's a tool to avoid these revolts of the masses.
Thanks. Jack Halberstam, Columbia. I guess I want to ask Fulvia if you would expand a little bit on your sense that the coming insurrection is regressive, and we don't need to argue about that specifically, but just to say that the coming insurrection is the only thing we read that actually addresses the reproduction of the past in the future through the mechanisms of the family and domestic heteronormativity and the body. So I was really happy you brought up the Parliament of Bodies, Preciado's project in Athens and Kassel, that I think was an attempt to direct our attention not only to the abstract categories of class and revolution, but also to the way in which the body is the site of both inscription and resistance, and that some of the insurrections that we're interested in are going to come from the body without simply being identity politics. And I'm pretty sure that when Angela Davis is critiquing identity politics or is calling for a kind of abolitionist society, it's not a critique of identity politics in the way that the right wing is doing it. It's understanding, for example, that in the US, probably the most powerful form of Maoist thought was the Black Panthers, with a critique of racial capitalism and an interest in thinking about violence. And that's not an identity politics. That's actually understanding that racial inscription gives you insight into the way in which the body is positioned across a whole set of, yes, uneven developments, but also contradictions, but also desire. So I'd love it if we talked about the body a little bit, and that was the only text that really allowed us to do so. So rather than just allow it to stay on the trash heap, I just want to pull it back in for that purpose.
Okay, one last question, and then we'll throw it back to us.
Sure. I'm Mike. I'm a grad student in the seminar. I have a question about the model of contemporary insurgency that we find in the Invisible Committees, the Coming Insurrection. As Bernard acknowledged in his opening comments, the text asks the reader to transform the self because winning the support of the masses is ultimately hopeless. But I wonder if the text with this focus on transforming the self repeats the very kind of neoliberal rationality that it opposes. So that is, if the neoliberal subject, let's say, is the subject who reasons solely on the basis of economic self-interest, conditions of contemporary precarity, forced to withdraw from others who threaten to otherwise replace him, and to constantly transform the self to ensure a place in the world that cannot guarantee a place for him or her. Doesn't the contemporary insurgency model in the Coming Insurrection repeat this move, this focus on the withdrawal to transform the self? And if so, how viable is it for resistance in our contemporary moment?
Thanks very much. That is a feast of questions. We have, is 1977, Fulvia was your account to Rosie. Clara, largely Claudia, is not the dialectical materialism chez Mao integral to his intervention, political intervention in the party, and potentially continually integral to political diagnoses and interventions today. Orly raises the question of the materiality of Mao's thought and the way in which the transmission of that thought could be emancipatory, could be regulatory, that it needs to happen, but then the sort of normative valences of it. Jack raises the role of the body as a politics that exceeds superficial critiques of identity politics, and then similarly, coming back to the Coming Insurrection, the real tactical question of the relationship between Coming Insurrection's tactical portfolio and potentially the Maoist portfolio.
Yeah. Should I start? Okay, so Simona, I don't have a crystal ball, so I am not sure of what would have happened of 77 if it had continued. It was also a very heterogeneous movement, and it was plagued by many inner crises and collapses, you know, the tumult, the chaos that is inevitable in this type of experimentations that were, you know, many levels, and amongst other levels with the substances and with drugs that reveal themselves as one of the deadliest weapons used by secret services to destroy people once the repression was engaged. That completely created a total desert. But I think that if the Communist Party had acted differently, and which obviously wasn't possible because otherwise it would have happened, but if the power had been intelligent there, if there had been a moment of, how would I say, enlightenment rather than complete fear and regression and total stupidity. I mean, in that sense, I open a parenthesis, we need to see how the legacy of 68 was lost at this point, right? Because I wouldn't say that many people that did 68 were in power, but certainly the protagonist of 68 and the protagonist of 77 don't have much in common in Italy. And this is a very sad story that we're not probably going to talk about here. But I would say if we could imagine a legacy of 77 that could have taken place, is something that really reminds me that the project of the autonomia more than Maoist project, so something closer to the council ideology, you know, to this idea of a sort of federalism, of a capillary presence on the territory, of the wildcat strikes, like the COBAS, you know, the wild committee of support of the abuses at work. And in this way, you know, the autonomy was very strong at diffusing a sort of politics that changed locally the struggle balance. you disagree, okay. And then I would say that, yeah, generally speaking, it's a legacy of direct democracy, and I would say that one of the main notes, in my opinion, would have been the problem of feminism, you know, because it was somehow in the background, but it was the huge conflict in place and was deeply and profoundly unresolved because the couple form kept coming back, and today, I mean, I don't even want to talk about it, but there was on one hand this very experimental component that created the fragility and the openness, paved the way to repression, which was the use of substances, the refusal of hierarchies, and so the difficulty at creating a logistic organization, and the problem of feminism that was, key because these identities and, the contradictions that came from the feminist analysis and had to be seen were deeply unresolved and still are. We are much worse off than we were back then. And if I can connect to the question of Jack, I would say that yes, today, I mean, this new materialism of the body and this identity politics that is not identitarian, is, I think, is the only hope, the only possible way we can go, because very simply, without wanting to be so positive and jolly about rehabilitating the idea of desire, etc. Bifo was recently reciting the statistic. We were in an event last year in Rome, this conference on communism, and there was a side event that was very beautiful in the National Gallery of Modern Art in Rome. And he was quoting the statistics on people having sex today. It's like a tenth of whatever it was in '77. So there is, I think, in this politics of desire, I think we need to take into account the social fabric. It's not that people like each other like this and there's chemistry. This is Hollywood. There is a real texture of life that needs to be recreated. There is this idea of the communist love that Rancière talks about, and I think this is a very Maoist idea somehow that he still preserves, that basically people have to have reasons to love each other, right? They have to be able to experiment something that is not only sexual desire, that is communist love for each other, desire to be together, solidarity, affection for each other, desire to raise children and have only the ones that we want to have, and all these basic things need to be restated, and it's a real problem we're encountering, that liberalism is winning on these points, completely, like totally, and destroying the residual conquest that this old social system still based on the patriarchal family and the Catholic affection for each other could feed off, especially in Italy. Today, all this is gone, and we don't have the new thing that we need. So we should get to work on that.
No, about 77. We were in Bologna. Well, your question is a very interesting question. What could happen without the deliberate repression of 77? I think that the most interesting could be an assessment of the 60s, because one element important in the 67 was, in 77, sorry, was a self-critical attitude toward what happened, in different form, Dadaism, etc. Feminism, feminism was very a self-critical element in that moment, at every level, about organization. In 74, 75, the main radical groups, Lotta Continua, collapsed under the criticism of feminism. This is what was extremely important. So one must say that, the 68 and 77, the people were so different. Before was in 68 and in 77 very active. And we too were in 68 and 77. Of course, we were different persons in 77, and we shared the same attitude, the same need of rethinking critically the 68. You know. Another important, there are two elements you said were very complicated. I understand what you mean. Maybe you refer to terrorism, etc., and other elements. The two elements that complicate the situation, in my opinion, were on one side, the groups, the political group that aroused in 68 were in full crisis, lotta continua, potere operaio, etc. And the second aspect was the secret apparatus of the state that since 69 organized bombs and mass murders, you know, and even the so-called the terrorist groups in Italy were interconnected with the secret services. You think to the murder of Aldo Moro without the Italian secret service could be impossible in 78 to kidnap Aldo Moro. So these were the two elements. A third element was that when 77 was not simply an insurgency. When the insurgency was in March 77, the situation was very quiet, very calm. The insurgency was provoked, you remember well, by the murder of a student. And so it was created. Claudia is right comparing 77 with the Tiananmen 89. Also in 89, when the insurgency happened in the square, the situation was very quiet. It was produced by the state intervention, was a provocation. So, well, it was deliberate. Of course, the state apparatus understood very well the weakness of the movement at the moment and decided in 77 in Bologna, as in 89 in China, that to provoke an insurgency could be a very good for the state to give a lesson to everybody.
So we only have about 10 minutes left. I'd like to hear from Claudia, and then I'm going to throw it to Bernard.
Try to answer I want to add the fact that it's true that at that time the situation was very tense in 77, but also for other two reasons. Not only that after 68 there was not an assessment, a real assessment, so the group that couldn't do a real assessment disbanded, not only, but in 1972 there was a kind of a disaster among all the best groups, up to the point that a part of the very, very clever people went out of mind. Other became toxic. Other became alcoholic. So there were a disaster, human disaster. Then the effect of this human disaster was a persecution against autonomy. The workers' autonomy were persecuted, accused a few years later of belonging to be the chief of Red.
Organizer of the kidnapping of Moro.
Yes. So after it was proved that it was wrong, it was organized, but also in the other side, in the side of the secrets of Italy, there were a lot of other provocations: the train, the square, the bombing in the bank. There are a lot of mysterious facts that are still mysterious. Ustica. So, Italian life was very difficult. So I believe that 77, the provocation of this young student hit it on the back. He was simply running, and somebody killed him on purpose. was something too strong for the other students. That's why they insert. And the reason was very strong. People tend to forget this. Then I want to answer to you. I shift to another theme. You said that you reading Mao's the On Contradiction, you consider that it was not very clear the difference between philosophy and politics. I understand wrong? No. Mm. Mm. Well, I think it helps me to understand more his thinking, trying to divide his philosophical thinking and his political action. Though it's true that up to 1949, he was organizing the masses more for not just not to create a civil war, but to make people liberation, a people war, people's war. So to make themselves be able to liberate. That was the useful, why it was useful philosophy for them. There is a famous sentence by Mao where that I think it's crucial to understand his attitude also toward women. He said we should not think that we have to destroy the altar of the widows, the peasant widows. They were ritual altar built when a woman was widow. It's a ritual of sacrifice, but they built this kind of altar, arch, in honor of this widow. But they say they chaste widows. Chaste widows. L'altare delle vedove caste. He says, we are not those who can tell them they should destroy this kind of altars, even if we are fighting together with them. It's the peasants themselves and the women themselves that should destroy this kind of ritual altar of chaste widows. I think this is the line of also toward women. Mao was one of his first texts was in defense of a child widow. No, a child bride that was forced to marriage. She was very young and she suicided. So he was organizing an entire debate in his town, producing 5-6 articles himself just to open the debate about the condition of women in the society. And that was in 1919. So since then, he's always was for the liberation of women and saying there is no not the equality because they are no equal. So it peer relations, but not equal.
Disquiet.
Disquiet.
Okay.
Disquiet.
All right, so maybe we'll just close on a last conversation that was kind of going on between Aurélie, I think, and Jack and Mike, and having to do with the coming insurrection. And I was hearing two themes. One was something about the body and subjectivity, and the role of the family and thinking through these mechanisms of control and liberation through that lens. And on that particular issue, actually, in terms of the role of the family and the cell, etc., Jesus just posted a brilliant intervention on the blog that you should read about picking up on La Chinoise and the notion of the cell and the way in which the cell is reproducing the family, etc. But there's that, and then Mike, I was hearing something about the relationship between subjectivity and withdrawal in the text, which I felt very seriously as well. Now, I mean, one big question, of course, is to what extent is the coming insurrection, do we call it a Maoist-inspired document? And so how do we treat this lineage, and is it fair to do that? So that's one whole question we almost need to set aside. But I think that when I'm thinking about the relationship between kind of body subjectivity and withdrawal, it seems to me as if it's not necessary. It's not necessary to the argument and to parts of the argument in the coming insurrection, or to include the amount of withdrawal that is there, right? And so in other words, I think working through the body and subjectivity does not necessarily entail the kind of commune separation and distance from what could be considered others that is in that text. And I'm not sure where that comes from, and I'm not sure that it's appropriate to connect that particular dimension to Maoism, right? Which I actually don't think. But of course, we did want to end with the coming insurrection, or at least bring the trajectory to the present, in part because there are, with the exception of a few people in this room, few kind of contemporary Maoists, right, or self-proclaimed Maoists, but of course there is a whole Maoist-inspired insurrectional paradigm that is interesting today. With that, I think we'll end the session. Thank our guests extraordinary.